Okay, thank you everyone for your patience in regards to me getting all these edits done. Quick background, we've had a bit of fun since we came back from the Tarkine with COVID and a few other things, not myself, but pretty much everyone else in the family. So I've been in a swag for a while, in a garage, so I had to move my whole office and get down to do this. So I'm in the garage, set up in the man cave, ready to do this. So as discussed on the workshop, we were going to do some edits. So what I've done, I've got a few images down the bottom. I'm going to do a few at a time for each person, and then we'll go through each one. So down the bottom you'll see there's a few images. I haven't done everyone's images. I've picked a selection of about 3 or 4 of each person just to make it feasible for me to do it without spending hours and hours and hours of editing. So yeah, we'll get into it. So I've imported these images. The first set of images we're going to do is Sam's images. So I'm not going to go through how you import stuff into Lightroom. It is fairly straightforward how to import stuff, but it can get a bit tricky when you're talking about keywords and categorizing and cataloging and things like that. It can become a bit of a nightmare. So what I thought I would do is just go through how I would edit these photos from start to finish. So first things first, I've got the little red circle there so you can see what I'm doing. Up on the left hand side here, you've got a bit of details on what the photo is, the file size, the time it was taken. If you press I on your keyboard, I for igloo, it scrolls through a series of information there. So it tells us that it was shot at 1.5 seconds, f11, ISO 100. It was shot on a 24-70 2.8 lens from Canon. This is shot at 24mm. So this shot we got, this is a shot I helped Sam with on the beach that we sort of saw as we're walking along. And yeah, I've got a very similar shot to this, which turned out pretty well. So I'm assuming this will come up just as well as Sam's did, as well as mine did. So first things first, on the right hand side, you'll see that we've got the histogram. So we spoke about the histogram on the workshop a lot. And histogram represents everything from your shadow detail to your highlight detail and everything in between. So this is a good looking histogram. We've got a little bit of room at the back here in the shadow ends, but it is pushing up against the sky a little bit, so you can see that sky is a little bit brighter. These two little boxes up here I tick are just what they call indicators, so clipping indicators. So if you're underexposing, it'll show blue for your shadow detail that's losing detail. And if you go too far, it goes red, which will show you that you've blown out your sky. So if you open up a file like this and it's got lots and lots of red there, that's not a good thing. That means that you've lost a lot of detail out of those highlights and becomes very, very hard to bring that information back. So keep an eye on that. Use those two things. I leave them on as we go along. Sometimes they get a bit annoying. You can switch them on and off. That's not a problem. So what I like to do is I like to work down my way down these tools. I don't do it in any particular order, just top to bottom. Some people like to go all over the place. I like to just make it nice and easy. So the first thing is your color temperature. Now, shooting in RAW, you've got all your control over color temperature, so you can make it warmer, darker, cooler, whichever option you go. I generally leave that towards the end a bit more. I might warm this up a little bit, but there will be some adjustments I make to that as we go along, I suspect. The next one, that's tint. So this is where you can sort of make things a bit more magenta or a bit more, yucky color. I don't tend to touch that at all, unless I'm trying to get a bit of a magenta or a purple feel to my sunsets or sunrises. I don't generally touch that too much. So let's have a look. Let's have a bit of a play. So exposure. The fact is that off the bat, we know that there's a bit of detail on that sky. Like, we don't really have any blown highlights out of there because we've got the clipper on. So what we can assume is that color and the moon, and we can see the moon up there as well, that information there is always going to be there. So we've got that information on the file, which is great. So what we can do then is, I like to sort of start in the foreground. I like to say, well, let's get this foreground okay. I'm ignoring the sky for now. I'm not even worrying about the sky. So let's have a look at the foreground. Let's make sure we get this looking nice and cool in there. It's nice and sharp. There's an amazing little moon reflection in there. That was well seen by Sam. So I'm going to make that a little bit brighter, about a stop over. Contrast, obviously contrast will give you a bit more definition between your lights and your darks. So you'll see there that if you go too far, you start getting really harsh blacks, and you get a lot of stark contrast between your highlights and your shadows. So I find that anywhere sort of around about sort of plus 30 to plus 40 works for most of my files. We'll go in the middle here, we'll go sort of plus 35. And on your keyboard, if you press Y for yellow, you can go between before and after. So automatically you can see we've warmed it up a bit. You know, that foreground, which is what we're concentrating on, the rocks there looking pretty cool. Got some beautiful golden light on those rocks just by doing a couple of little adjustments. Highlights, the highlight slider. So we can bring that down. That'll help the sky a little bit, but we're going to play with the sky a bit separately later on. So for the highlights, I'm still just looking at what we're talking about, the rocks, the detail in these rocks here. Not losing too much. So maybe about sort of minus 45. Just to bring, you don't want to dull them out too much, but you don't want them blowing out either. So we've got to make sure that stays how it is. Shadow detail, obviously that you can bring the shadows up or bring the shadows more darker. For the moment, I reckon it's okay from where I can stand. Maybe just a tad, just to help the shadows in here a little bit to sort of, and you can see we're getting a little bit of blue in there, which means we're losing detail, but the detail's not important. You know, if you're losing the detail through here, in this shadow bit here, then that's a different story. So white, that just changes your white position, so purely the whites or the blacks. I don't really touch them too much in my shots. I usually leave them how they are. The next one down here, so that's the general adjustments for exposure, overall exposure. That's what they call a global exposure. Now what we can do if we want to start playing around with this sky, we can do that now if you want. So what up here, there's a series of tools here which you can play around. So the first one's a crop tool, so if we want to, you know, crop it down or straighten it up, there's a straightening tool as well, but I'm just going to straighten that horizon up a little bit, just across here looked a little bit wobbly. The next one's a heal tool, so if you had some dust spots and stuff like that, we'll have a look at that later on. Red eye reduction tool, which we obviously don't need in here, but this is the one we're going to play. This is the masking tool. So there's a couple of ways you can play this. You could either say, let's put a mask and select the sky only, or let's do a linear gradient, which is the same as a neutral density gradient filter, where you have a dark to light sort of gradient filter on the front of your camera. I tend that works a bit better for me, so I'm going to use the linear gradient filter. So what you can see, it opens up a new box over here, and you'll see there, I'm just going to turn that filter thing off there. You see there it's got a crosshair on it. So pretty much what you're doing is you're creating the effect of a graduated filter. So you can see there it's sort of dark to light and graduates down to the bottom. So I'm going to pull that down to where it just affects sort of just in around about here somewhere. So anything that's red on this section here is going to get affected by the adjustments I do in this light grey box. So you've still got all your exposure details down there, but this is a different box that's affecting purely the mask or the red section that we've played in. So you can then say, right, well, let's just drop that information down. Let's bring that down a few stops there. You know, we're going to bring it down 3 and a bit stops. You know, you might put a bit of contrast in there. You might take the highlights down a bit more. And at any stage, you can say, right, well, I want to make that come down a bit more. I want it to come down a bit higher. So maybe I was seeing now there's a bit of a blob there. So we might make that effect just come down a bit further. So it's actually reaching down a bit further now. And again, we can sort of start playing around with that a bit more. Play around with the highlights a bit. No real shadow detail in there at all. You can make the texture, you can make it a bit more, you know, misty or foggy in a way. You can make the texture a bit more hazy. You can sort of make it more more clarity or less clarity. You can actually play around with this. I like to make my skies look a little bit sort of softer. I won't touch that at all there. And what you can also do with the skies is, this is where I was saying before, you can actually, you know, you can sort of change the color temperature of the sky only. I think something along the lines of a bit of blue in that sort of sky, and this is where you can say, right, well, I want to maybe just add a bit of magenta to it. So without going too crazy, without making it look purpley purple, you can sort of make it look a bit like that. And again, you can sort of see that there's a bit of a nice now purple tinge to that sky, which is looking good. So once you've finished doing your sky, you go down to here and press done. And then what it does, it takes you back to adjusting the whole image overall. So you're back to adjusting, you know, the whole exposure, everything like that. But what you've done now is, because you've got the information in that file in the sky, you've actually now got all the detail of the sky. If you push the other way, where you're overexposed and trying to expose for the shadows in the foreground, it makes it a lot harder to try and get these highlights back under control. Especially with the dynamic ranges of cameras we have these days, you can actually get a lot of information back in shadows, but not as much information in highlights. But if you're shooting at this time of day, which is the perfect time of day for this shot, then you should be able to get all that information within one shot quite easily without needing to do filters or exposure blending or bracketing or anything like that. The other thing we're going to look at is this dust spot up here. I'll just bring that back a bit more. There's a little dust spot. So if you go up to the little band-aid tool here, which is the heal tool, and down the bottom there's a thing that says visualize spots down here on the left hand side. So what you can do is you crank this up here where it actually starts showing you anything that's a little circle is a dot, and you can make that a bit smaller, that little cursor, and all you do is hover over that, press the button, and it picks a spot from the rest of the file and gets rid of that dot for you. So it's always good to go around your file and have a look and see what's there, and it looks like it's all pretty clean apart from that one. So moving down here, the next one is, like I said, this is all we've done, a couple of little adjustments, and it's already looking pretty damn good, I reckon. Texture, this is what I was saying before, where you can sort of get, really smooth, sort of buttery feel about it, or you can go really harsh with texture. As a standard for mine, I like to sort of drop my texture down a little bit, maybe about -10 or -15, just gives it a little bit of a nice soft feel. The clarity, again, be careful with clarity, you can go a bit too far with that. I like to go about +10 with my clarity, and dehaze as well. Be careful with dehaze. Dehaze people get a bit addicted to dehaze. You got to be a bit careful. But I like to sort of do around about sort of +10 my dehaze. It just helps sort of give a little bit more contrast to it without sort of going too crazy. But there's some beautiful detail in that sand there. You can actually see it's nice and sharp all the way through. It's a little bit soft out there, but I reckon that could be a bit of sea spray that was coming in as well. Saturation and vibrance, I don't usually touch them too much. If anything, saturation I might go sort of +5 and vibrance +5, just a little bit. Less is more for me. The next section down is the tonal curve, which is where you can play around more so with just purely your highlights. And you can see if we play around with the highlights, the histogram moves up the top there, and you'll find that the sky is getting a bit crazy. But because we've already done some adjustments on the sky, we don't want to go too much with the highlights. So maybe like a +10. And same with the shadows, like we don't want to get too many shadows lost in there either. So probably maybe only like a -5 for the shadows and highlights. So yep, that's looking pretty cool. We've got this beautiful little Easter egg in there, which I usually say is great for little photos. The horizon's nice and straight. We've got some beautiful colour in the sky. Got this beautiful rock in the foreground. The next section down is the colour. So on your colour here, you've got a hue, saturation, and luminance. So hue will change the colour of the colour. So if it's a red, it'll change it to a different colour. Saturation will change the richness of the colour. So red to be really, really red, or green to be really, really green. Luminance is what I usually use for my adjustments. So luminance is the brightness of the colour. So it doesn't actually change the intensity of the colour or change the colour itself, but it just changes the brightness of it. So, for example, the blue in the sky, we can sort of, you can dull that down a bit or take a bit of the intensity out of that. The orange and sand, you can sort of make that a bit brighter. So I'm just making some adjustments here. The yellow, there's probably a bit of yellow there as well. Just got to be careful when you're doing this not to go too far, because you'll get what's called banding. So if we go really far on the yellow over here, you can see you start getting these artifacts, these really sort of crappy looking things. So you just want to be careful. So I'm just sort of minimising these down a bit, making them a bit darker. Won't be any green in there. There's obviously a bit of purple in the sky. You can sort of play around with that a bit, and a bit of magenta. Again, pressing Y on the keyboard before and after, just have a look. Looks pretty good. Next one down is your sharpening. So Lightroom and Photoshop probably will default your sharpening out of camera to 40, which is where I leave it. But what you can do down the bottom is also chuck a sharpening mask over the top. So like what we did with the sky, where you're putting an extra thing over the top of the original file, what the sharpening mask does, it actually puts an extra level of sharpening over the whole picture. So what you can do is you can actually slide this to where you want it to be. But if you hold down the Option key or the Alt key on your PC, hold that down and slide that mask. You see it starts off all white. So what it does, as you slide that towards 100, anything that's white is getting sharpened, everything that's black is not getting sharpened. So I like to go to around about sort of +85 on mine. So you can see there, that's really just the outlines of all the shapes, the clouds, the rocks, the moon are getting adjusted. So it's just giving you an extra layer of sharpening around all the edges, which is really handy for when you're printing. So if we have a look now in there, you'll see there that, you know, the rock in there is pretty damn sharp now. It's got some really good sharp edging as opposed to the original file, all around the sand there as well. So I go to around about sort of plus 85, almost as a default to all my shots is where I go. There's some things that I do similar, and I'll do it through here as well. There's some things that I do the same through every one of my shots, just to try and create that sort of consistency with my editing. Noise reduction, we don't need to do any noise reduction here. There's absolutely no noise in that. That's pretty good. It's shot at 100 ISO on the tripod, so you sort of eliminate that noise straight away. Some cameras will automatically do the chromatic aberration adjustments and lens profile adjustments. So you'll see there when you turn the lens profile off, it does all these warping adjustments. So every lens out of any manufacturer, doesn't matter if it's a $10 lens or a $10,000 lens, they all have some sort of imperfection. What Lightroom does, or Adobe does, it has all the lens profiles that are given to them by the manufacturers to correct all those adjustments. Chromatic aberration is when you get some funky things coming through your lens. You get this little purple hazing and fringing. It gets around the edges of things. That automatically is turned on as well. Transform, if this was a bit more of a complex shot, you might be able to press auto and get the horizon set up properly, or a tree straightened or something like that. We've done that already with the crop tool up here, where we straighten it a little bit as well. So we don't need to worry about that. And the last one is the vignetting. So vignetting is when you can put a bit of a border around the outside. Obviously that's for the 1970s wedding shots. But I always, again, another default, usually go around to sort of about -10, -5, just to sort of help draw the viewer's eye into the frame and not sort of so much around the outside. So that is how I would edit that shot. Like I said, there's not much that I do with editing, and you might be a bit disappointed thinking there's all this trickery and witchcraft that goes on with my editing. There's not. And we'll probably see as we go through these files, there's some files and images that are maybe not exposed as well as they could be, which you'll see that we need to do a bit more work on them. But the ones that are out of camera, that are looking good and have a pretty good histogram and haven't blown out any highlight detail or shadow detail, they should be very easy to edit. They shouldn't be something you spend hours on. You know, this has taken me, 15 minutes or so to do this one. But usually this would be a 5-minute job to get it right. And again, you'll see through what we do here, there's some things that I keep consistent. So, you know, if I'm using the same camera, my contrast is almost the same through every shot. My vibrance and saturation, my texture, clarity and dehaze are the same. My sharpening is always the same. My vignetting is always the same. So it creates a real consistency in your imagery and your edits as well. So that's how I'd edit that one. All right, next image we'll do is another one of Sam's. So we're going to do 3 of Sam's, I think it is. Again, so that first video we did, I think the sound was a bit funny, had a bit of an echo in it, so I apologise for that. I hope I fixed that now. So what we're going to do now is another one of Sam's, take it in the forest. Trying to mix it up where we take shots from. So again, you can see at the top left-hand corner there, this is taken, what time it was? It's taken a 13th of a second, 5.6 ISO 400, aperture, shutter, focal length 24mm. The first thing I'm noticing about this, I like it, it's an interesting shot. But the first thing I've noticed here is this foreground is quite soft, and that's because we're using 5.6. So, you know, we're focusing over here, which is super duper sharp, really cool. But you'll see that the focus and sharpness drops off as we go down the bottom. So in this situation, I'd be looking at sort of shooting about f11, f16, around about here, just so that foreground picks up the focus as well as the background as well. So you can see the background's a bit soft. Having said that, you know, if you did want to just highlight this fern purely on its own, then, you know, that's the way you would do it. You would focus on there at 5.6 or f4, and you let the foreground and everything sort of fall out of focus naturally. So again, looking at the top here, histogram looks good. We've got everything again. Again, this is a really nice, easy sort of dynamic range to work with. There's no super duper highlights. There's no real dark shadows. It's all nice and evenly spread. The light looks good. So again, this should make things pretty easy to make an edit out of, a nice edit as well. So again, we'll start from up here. Whether or not we play around with the color temperature. Forest shots can be a bit of both. People like to make them a bit warmer. Some people like to go a bit cooler. I'm going to leave that for now and maybe come back to it and just see how it feels after we do a bit of editing. So again, the exposure. One thing I've noticed here, which probably hasn't been used the right way, is the polarizing filter as well. You can see there's a lot of highlights on all these little branches and leaves here. Having a polarizer would definitely help get a lot of those reflections out, and you get more of this true color like this one down here. So that's taking away a little bit of the greenness that's in those forests, but let's have a play around with it. So bring the exposure up a bit. Contrast. Again, contrast is pretty good. We can go a bit higher. Again, I'm sort of looking around about sort of maybe about 30, plus 30. Just keeping an eye on, these details under here. We don't want to get in too grungy, where you can't really see anything. There's usually a sweet spot where it just starts to pick up, where you start seeing the contrast catching. And it's around about on here, it's about plus 30 on this one. So we'll look at that. Highlights again, just looking at those leaves, you can see where all the highlights are, also up in this back left-hand corner, and the leaves here. So play around with those a little bit, probably about minus 60. Shadows again, like a lot of people think that you need to bring shadows out, but shadows actually work for you in the forests quite a lot. So I'm happy to bring the shadows down. It just helps, automatically I can see it sort of giving these dark shades and shadows of the prongs and stuff like that looking good. Over here, still got detail. You can still see the details on the tree. You can still see all the details under there as well. So about minus 20 for the shadows. Don't touch the whites and blacks. I'm not a big fan of doing that. Again, this is where I'm pretty consistent. I'd probably say let's just bring the texture down, bring the contrast up, and the dehaze up. We're talking minus 10 for texture, clarity, and dehaze are plus 10. You got to be a bit careful in forest about your vibrance and saturation, because greens can go really green real quick. So just be careful of that. If you go too much there, it looks a bit artificial. We might actually do like a plus 10 on the saturation this one. So again, if we just press Y for yellow, have a look what's going on. They're not huge differences, but you can see now that we've got some nice sort of detail. All these leaves and colours are coming out nicely. That looks good on that leaf as well compared to that one. And over here you got some, bit of nice warmth through there. We could do something to this one with that warmth up there like we did last time. You could also, drop a gradient in to the top here, like we did on the last one, where you drop that linear gradient down. And without really touching anything, what we could do is just sort of warm that background up a little bit if you wanted to. Sort of make it look like there's a bit more of a sunburst coming through there. Just playing around with that a little bit. And just sort of adding a bit to that background. Maybe I've gone a bit too much in there. We don't want to be like too warm because it's sort of not the same as the foreground. So maybe something about like that. It just sort of gives a bit of extra background boost to the greens and a bit of that backlighting. So yeah, moving down a bit further again, when we're talking highlights and shadows here, well, really the highlights in forests are all these tiny little bits of reflective light that are coming off all the trees. Again, that circular polarizer would make a huge difference to this picture. You'd find that instead of getting this glare off the forest floor, you get more of the true color of the browns and everything coming through there. There's a lot of reflections off all these broken branches and things like that. So highlights again, just watching the leaves in the background there, we'll add a little bit of highlights in there, maybe about plus 30. Shadows, again, we don't want to go too grungy. We just want to, probably just when it's catching, so mainly minus 10, really. So you can see that we've just added a bit of vibrance, a bit of colour. We can't do much about that foreground being soft as we discussed, but we're making it work for what it is. It's a nice forest shot. We've added a bit of warmth to that background. If anything, maybe just having a look there, and you can go back up, you can go up and change things. You might just add a bit more of, I'm just going to add a little bit more exposure to that, just a bit brighter. And then we'll go down to the luminance. So this is where, this will probably play a bit of a part in this one because there's a lot of bright colours in here as well. So oranges, lots of oranges on the forest floor. You can see all those little myrtle leaves light up. So you can actually bump them up a bit so they actually stand out a bit more. There's probably a bit of yellow in the background. We can take a bit of that intensity out a bit. So there, it's obviously going to be green. So again, we can just play around with that green, maybe just bring that green down a little bit. There's also generally a bit of purple in that foreground as well. So we can we can probably try and alleviate the effects of not having that polarizer on a bit more by just dulling down the purple so it's not as bright. Again, if we look at that difference there, we've got some really nice colours in here now. We've got a good array of, browns, oranges and reds, greens, yellows, things like that. So it's working. The sharpening again now, you push down the Option key on your Mac or Alt key up to 85. Again, you can see it's just there's lots of edging, lots of details to sharpen there, but that's where I sort of sit on most of that. Now, you don't have to hold down the Option or Alt key. You can just go straight to 85 if that's your default, which it is for me. So that's how usually that's how easy it can be. You don't have to worry about trying to see how much it's going to sharpen. If you're happy with that effect, then you just go straight to that number. Everything else is turned on there. There's no real need to straighten anything up here. It's all, it's a forest scene. Everything's chaos. It's meant to be a bit out of control. This is still distracting me a little bit down here. The vignetting will help a little bit with that. But I might actually do a bit more of a heavier vignetting just so it sort of pulls away from that foreground and drags you a bit more into that middle scene. So here's a bit darker now. So I'm not really drawn to there. I'm more drawn to here, which is okay. There's actually a bit of possum poo on there as well. That's pretty funny. So yeah, that'll be, like I said, the forest shots can be quite easy. Maybe it's a bit too much saturation now that we've done a few other adjustments. So I might just bring that down. You could always look at it as black and white as well. We'll do a black and white along the way somewhere. Black and white you can do up here as well with a flick of a switch as well. So the other option again with that foreground, you could try and crop it, but as soon as you start cropping, you're going to crop all the ferns as well. So I'm inclined to leave it as is and do it as such like that. It's an interesting forest scene. You got some beautiful detail along this thing, along the fern there. The sharpness in here is really good. Again, just things to improve on this one. Again, just that if you want all this nice and sharp, I'd be looking at shooting like f11 or f16, focusing about a third of the way in. If you were just going for that fern only, that's fine as well. I would have probably just maybe tried to crop in camera a bit more with this foreground there. And the circular polarizer, I'm pretty sure it wasn't used in the right manner here. Otherwise, you would have had some really, really nice greens. This forest floor would probably be a lot more attractive and not as much of these white little branches all reflecting the light above. So just keep that in mind. Polarizers can be a bit tricky. Just give them a couple of spins around until you see the effect, and you'll notice the difference. So yeah, that's how we would edit that one. Yeah, it's cool. All right, let's get on to the last one of Sam's. This is from Sarah Ann Rocks. Yes, it is. Again, awesome place, as you guys found out. You could spend days, if not weeks, photographing around that area. Straight off the bat, looks good. I like the fact that the horizon looks dead straight, which is great across here. Got a bit of wind movement in the trees and the grasses there, which I don't mind. A lot of people will not like that, or they'll try and do multiple exposures to try and capture the grass not moving. But to me, that creates mood and movement through your shot as well as a bit of nature itself. Like it's Mother Nature at a fury throwing wind across the west coast. So I don't mind that movement. So don't stress if you got movement in your grasses. I think it's pretty cool. The rocks don't move, which is the main thing. I like the framing here. It's pretty good. Shot half a second, f11, ISO 100, 24mm, which is cool. So we'll just get out of that bit there. This little bit up here could be a bit distracting. One thing I like to do is always just check around the edges of my frame straight off. So before we maybe even start editing this, we might even just crop it down a bit, just from that corner, just so we don't have that big sort of blob of rock in that top can corner. So maybe something like that is a little bit less distracting to me. So that's an easy fix. Again, looking at the histogram, turning on the histogram clips. Again, we haven't lost any detail in the sky, so well done there. And a little bit of shadow detail missing is there, which is not a big deal. So again, well managed exposure, using that dynamic range to our advantage, where we've got everything from the darks to the lights under control without losing detail. So that's awesome, well done. Again, so we'll go down and play around with this. Usually late afternoon, I'll add a little bit of warmth to this as we go along. Again, we might come back and fix that. I'm not going to change any tints or anything like that as yet, but we'll bring this up a bit. Again, we just want to make sure there's a little bit of wave detail going on out there, and obviously the sky. We don't want to go too far. Again, I'm looking at that foreground. We can fix that top section like we did on the other image pretty easy. So probably around about there. Contrast, again, seems to be with this camera, it's around about plus 35 for contrast for the Canon, where it starts to look like it's doing its job properly. That's pretty cool. The highlights, again, you can see now, because we've got so much detail to play with, because we've got all that dynamic range, you can really just drop that down a bit. So we can drop that down a bit there. The sky is going to be really good. So again, I can sort of up the foreground a bit more, drop the highlights down a bit, start to sort of balance this all out a bit, which is cool. Again, the shadow detail, we don't want to go too far with that. Probably only maybe like -5, just to give it a little bit of darkness into those shadows there. Don't touch the whites and the blacks. Again, the texture, I usually do -10. I do +5, +10, +10 dehaze and clarity. It's beautiful sharpen there. What was it? F11. So that's really good. So we've got sharpness in the foreground, we've got sharpness out the back there, we've got sharpness there. So sharpness everywhere. It's good. That's what we want. A nice big sharp scene. What I might do here, there's another one we can play around with the masking. So where we've been doing the linear gradient, there's also a new one which selects sky. So you can press select sky. Lightroom does its little detecting sky bit and automatically just masks perfectly in that sky. So now you can say, all right, I just want to play around with that sky only. It can be a bit harder to play with this one, I find. It can be a bit more harsh in regards to what we're doing there. So I'm just playing around a little bit with, you know, the color and the color temperature of the sky. I'm adding a little bit of a tint to it so it looks a bit more of a late afternoon. Don't want to go too much underexposing. Actually, we're going to overexpose a little bit. Contrast, probably around about +40. Let's see what those highlights are doing. Again, you don't want to go too far. It just looks like it starts to lose a bit of its detail there. So might be like a -40 there again. This is where your texture and stuff could come in handy. You could sort of maybe pull the texture right down so it starts to look like there's a bit of a sea fog out there. Clarity, again, just be careful with that clarity on the sky. And then the dehaze, again, you don't want to be doing that. That looks terrible. So I'd almost be inclined just to do a little bit of dehazing. So that's about where I put that. Again, that looks pretty cool out there. You've got some beautiful detail. A little bit of light coming in from behind there, which is great. Now we've got a little bit of colour and detail in the sky. Looking good. So again, just with minimal adjustments, straight away you can start to see that you've got all this colour and detail and highlights and shadows. Everything's in these photos, which is great. And this place has got so many great textures and colours to play with. So moving down, vibrance and saturation, we'll just add a little bit of those, +5 each. And then highlights and shadows is where we'll see what's going on with those skies a bit. So maybe +20 there. We don't want to go too dark. Again, don't get too grungy. Maybe just a little bit. Playing around with individual color channels. So there's lots and lots of orange in here, so we can sort of make those grasses come to life a little bit more. There's obviously a lot of yellows in there as well. Probably just going to tone the yellow down a little bit. There's a bit of green in that grass. You can sort of see the little shrub in the very front and off to the left are moving around a bit, so we can play around with them, make them stand out a bit. Bit of blue in the ocean, we can play around with the blue a bit, make that ocean look a bit darker. And that's about it there. Again, I'm just going to put it up straight up to 85 for sharpening. Again, we've got some beautiful sharpness in this shot all the way through, so that's great. I really love this section out here, it looks awesome. Through here you got a nice little viewpoint, nice little V that you've created there. Nice little gap here as well, which I like between the top of the rocks and the peninsula out there, or the coastline. And then again, just a little bit of vignetting. Probably not much on this one because it is pretty dark around the edges anyway. Maybe I might just go up and bump up that exposure just a little bit to make sure I got my screen all the way up. Just bump that exposure up just a little bit more. So from that to that, that's the beauty of having a raw file. You can see here over the back here that's where the light's sort of coming in. It is losing a little bit of its funniness here, which might be that whole select sky thing. So if we go back into our mask, you can actually choose that again. We might just want to be careful how we go. Maybe the highlights are coming down. It's starting to create sort of a bit of issues around the edges there, which we don't want. and I think it's more, yeah, I don't know if it's more the sky detail or not. It's not doing it on this side. It might be more, looks like it might even be a bit of camera movement, a tiny little bit of camera movement, but anyway, that's not a big deal. If you're going to print this one, you might have a look at that a bit closer up in that corner to see what's going on. But overall, it's pretty damn good. So, yeah, again, like this is how easy it should be with your editing. If you come back with a really good file with plenty of detail and your dynamic range under control, that's all you should be doing is really minimal adjustments. There is a dust spot over there, so we'll go back to the little, and you can see straight away where that dust spot is. And if you hold down your space bar, you can actually move around your sky and just double check there's no others there, and there isn't. So looks like there's just that one little dust spot on your sensor, but that's about it. But yeah, that's again, that's a classic Sarah Ann rocks scene. All that beautiful color, drama, sharp rocks. We had really good conditions out there for sunlight, and that's what you need. So there's the 3 of Sam's edits. Yeah, really good, interesting shots you got there. Again, looks like your exposure's spot on. I'd just be looking just to make sure with your circular polarizer in the forest, be careful at that. But everything else is pretty good. Your compositions are good. Your exposure's good. Your detail's good. The way you're setting up your shots is good. So, yeah, that was good. Good work. Lovely shot. And hopefully that's giving you some insight on how to edit your images. Thanks. All right, next one we're going to look at is Karen's images here. We've got a few of hers to look at. So again, yeah, straight off the bat, just having a look at what we've got here. Karen was using the Canon, I think it was the R5 or the R6, can't remember exactly. It's got a 15 to 35mm lens. This is shot at 28mm. Shooting up into the trees, ISO 200, f20, a shutter speed of 1/30th of a second. So first things first, really cool with the starburst. For those that don't know, if you use a larger f-stop number such as f16 or f18 or f20, you'll create a starburst if you're looking into the sun. So the way the light travels through that aperture hole creates like a sunburst. So it's a pretty cool effect to try. All right, so let's have a look and see what we've got here. Obviously, we're going to have a bit of shadow and a bit of highlight issues there with that sun and the tree trunk, but again, we're not worried about the sun flare. There's no detail in the sun, so you can't worry about that. So that to me, this bit here is fine, works really well. What we want to probably do is just bring a bit of detail out on this trunk and see if we can make it interesting. But the blue sky, the sun flare, the nice bits of green light filtering through is pretty cool. So if we overexpose it, you can see there we're going to really start getting some effects there through that sun flare. We probably want to keep that sun flare a bit more under control and not get too much of that, psychedelic look coming through with all those rainbow colours and diffraction and things like that coming through the lenses. So what we can do, we can sort of play around a bit with these highlights and shadows, trying to get a nice little balance. The shadow detail on that trunk, again, because you can see how much detail is in there once we open it up. So again, the information's there. It's really important that you guys get that once the information's there, you're 9/10 of the way there. So what we want to try and do is just balance that out a bit, where we're getting some nice detail in that trunk. We're getting more of that green. That's not getting too out of control with how it looks, which is a good thing. Somewhere around about there, we'll chuck in some contrast. We might even warm this up a bit just off the bat a bit, just it's looking a bit cool. Shadow is generally a cooler color temperature, so we might just make that a bit warmer. These little artifacts here are a little bit distracting, but there's not much you can do about them really, unless you underexpose it all, and then you're going to lose that trunk. So it's a bit of a balancing act there. We're working with a pretty intense scene with that light there and the shadow there, but it's working. There's some beautiful sharpness in there. It's working okay. We'll give it a bit more contrast. Okay, and as normal, we'll do the texture and the contrast and texture, clarity, and dehaze the same as I always do. Still seems to work for the Canon files okay. Whether or not you added vibrance or took vibrance out, this could probably work as a black and white as well. We might just take a little bit of the saturation out. Otherwise, we start sort of getting a bit lost at this color in the green here. But what we will do, we'll play around with that blue filter when we get down to it, or the blue colour channel when we get down to it, because I think you can probably make that sky a bit bluer. Play around with the highlights a bit there. Again, the shadow detail we don't want to really play too much with. We've got it right where we've just got enough detail there to show the texture of the trunk. And again, pressing Y, you can see straight away like the amount of difference we've got there. Ideally, I'd like to keep the sun flare looking like that on here, but to do that, I just don't think we can, because we'd have to. We're running out. We can't. The dynamic range of this scene is just a bit too great to be able to manage both of them. You could definitely blend images, and you could definitely put an image like that, and then have it that way, and then blend this sort of exposure over the top of it. But that's not really what we do. So it's sort of more accepting what's happening with that lens and that flare coming through the lens. We'll play around with a bit of the colour. There's a bit of orange in there. We'll play around with that. It's definitely going to be yellow. You can sort of make the yellow a bit brighter, and the green, you can bump that up a bit there. It's working, that beautiful backlight all around through here. All those backlit leaves are working really well. The blue sky, we can sort of bring that down a bit as well. So we're sort of starting now, sort of bring in some really nice complementary colours where we've got the green and yellows playing against the blue, which is nice. Sharpening again, we'll go up to plus 85 as we normally do. So it's removing any chromatic aberration, which you might find also happens when you shoot into the sun. But the lenses handle it pretty well. Like, that's just a natural optical effect of what's going on with light passing through the glass. So that's not a problem. And then we'll put a bit of a vignetting on there. So yeah, something like that. It's pretty cool. Like I said, it'd be nice to sort of get it to look like that. We can probably maybe bump it up a bit more. Maybe bring the highlights down to that sun flare a little bit more. The colour temperature, I reckon, based on what it was, I think having it a little bit warmer just helps amplify these colours in the trees there. And again, like I said, you could do this one black and white as well. Black and white might actually work a bit better with that sun flare. You could probably get away with a bit more, having a bit more grungy and low contrast, low exposure. But I think it works well with the colour. I think the colour coming through the back of those trees is lovely. So yeah, that'd be how we do that one. There's no other major issues. This little section of tree up here hanging out over the frame, ideally it would be nice to have all that sky there, but again, it gives you a nice little window into what's going on. This little section here is nice. The detail on the tree is pretty cool. And it's well seen to get that sun flare. Like I said, you could keep it underexposed and just have the silhouette of what's going on. Another option you could have as well is, if you did this shot again, you could actually just sort of have, if I show you on the crop here, you could almost sort of just have, where are we? You could almost just have that scene only, like just a shot with that only, just a sun flare and some nice trees if you wanted to. But yeah, I think what you did is right, and I think it looks good. So don't be too fussed about that extra bit there. And we'll put it back to its original size. Yeah, that's cool. It's a good scene. It's a really cool, interesting forest scene. Like I said, we've got this beautiful colour. It's a really hard day as well. It was really sunny. The forest shots were really tricky on this trip. But using something a bit different, looking up, using a different aspect of how to look at a forest works, and I think you've done a good job there. So well done. All right, next one of Karen's we'll look at here looks like it's down at the edge of the world. This is interesting. That's pretty cool. I think I know where you were with this. I think you might have got some wet shoes just after this one as well, like everyone else did that night. Again, we're shooting at ISO 200 f16, 30 seconds, so quite a long exposure, which is why we're getting those beautiful sort of patterns in the clouds and on the water surface there. Shot at 20 mil, so relatively wide. I think this one could be interesting. It's going to be good. The first thing I've noticed just right off the bat is a little dust spot. So we'll go to our healing tool. If you go into there, you'll see the dust spot there. Just be careful. Sometimes you see dust spots that are actually stars. So these are actually stars that are popping up early, even though you might not see them on the shot. There is stars popping out. Are they stars? Hang on, that's an interesting question. No, they're not stars. They're actually hot pixels on your sensor. So what they are, they're just little pixels that have died on your sensor. If you're watching this, Karen, have a look at that on your files. That may need to go back to a manufacturer. There shouldn't be that many hot pixels on a camera of that quality. So they're not stars, they're actually what they call hot pixels. So maybe just have a look at that on other files as well to make sure there's no more hot pixels. It's not a huge deal, it just means you've got it like dust spots, but it just means there's a couple of pixels have died on your actual sensor. So just have a look at that as well. Next thing we'll do, we're going to straighten up that horizon just a little bit, and going to do it as shot. So a nice big sort of wide scene. This could work well if you're looking at cropping different ratios. You could do like a 16:9 here, but then we might lose some of those top clouds, so we'll just keep it as is there. But the main thing is it's keeping it straight. The other option you can do is if you go down to the bottom here into transform, and you can do level, and it'll level it out for you as well. Sometimes it doesn't seem to level it out as much as I want it to. But yeah, that's looking pretty good. So let's have a look and see what we're going to do with this one. Again, we've got some beautiful detail in the foreground, these rocks, everything that's going on there. We've got this beautiful sweeping sort of part here, and all these little bits down the bottom here are really cool. A little bit of a reflection of the moon. Yeah, we've got some interesting detail out here with all the dead trees and stuff like that. So we'll just bring up that exposure a little bit. We know we can play around with that sky a bit. That sky is going to be quite nice. You just want to be careful with these kind of scenes as well. It's a very sort of low saturated Pascal sort of feel to this scene. So you don't want to go too hard with your contrast, because you'll end up taking away a lot of that beautiful sort of soft feel to it. So I'm not going to put as much contrast in this one as normal. We'll probably go around about like plus 25. We'll bring down those highlights a little bit down in the sky. We'll probably play around with them a bit more as well. Color temperature, you know, whether or not you go a bit warmer or a bit cooler. Probably just a tad warmer than what it was out of the camera. Shadows, again, you know, what are we doing with shadows? We don't want to go too harsh with the shadows. We want to, I really want to try and keep the sort of light, saturated Pascal feel to this shot, so we'll keep it as that. So only a little bit of taking the shadows down a little bit. Texture, this is one where you might actually work with what you've got. So out here, because we've got a 30-second exposure, you've got some beautiful sort of foggy sort of feel. With the texture, you can actually, yeah, if you instead of doing -10 like I normally do, I'd probably go a bit more, maybe like -20, just to sort of add to the whole sea spray, fog, dreamy sort of feel to it. Again, clarity, I'd probably just go +10, and dehaze, maybe only about +5 here. Got a really nice feel with what's going on here, so we don't want to go too much with the contrast. Almost looking a bit smoky. Saturation, like I said, it's quite a low saturated shot. You might add a little bit of saturation and vibrance in there just to help those colors punch out a little bit. Highlights, and again, that sky, we've got to be careful of that. We don't want to go above. I think where it is, it's actually pretty good. And again, the shadows, we probably don't need to do much with the highlights and shadows. Maybe just drop them both down a little bit. Now, while we're doing that, what I might do is I might have a look at this sky, and because we've got a really big sky scene here, instead of doing the linear gradient filter, I'm going to press the select skies. This is one of these features where it just collects all the detail of the sky, and then, you know, let's put a mask over there, so then what it does, opens up again this masking toolbar here, and you can start to just play with that sky only. It's a pretty cool new feature that's come in. Again, looking at the contrast, you know, we can maybe add a bit to that sky, help with the highlights. We can bring a bit of that color down right on the horizon with the highlight adjustments. Again, we can stay with the texture. You know, you can actually bump the texture up. I still think we go down maybe even a bit more of that sky, so we're sort of going -30 with the texture. Clarity, we'll go +5, and we'll go +5 with the dehaze as well. So yeah, it's looking a little bit more colourful now. We've got a bit more contrast in it, but we've got some really lovely colours coming in compared to what we had beforehand. The moon's now sort of standing out a bit. Got some beautiful colour underneath these clouds, which is lovely. So yeah, that's looking really nice. Again, color channels, there's a bit of orange, you know, on the horizon there. There's probably a bit of yellow in there as well. And again, playing with these individual color channels, it really is just, each one is different. Like no two photos are the same. You know, you can really start to make that upper level there of the blue a bit darker. Probably a bit of purple out there. We can sort of help make that look a bit darker. Again, looking from the original file. And this is the super important thing about just getting it right in camera. Like you get back and you got these beautiful files you can play with you know, not much that you need to worry about doing apart from just playing around with a few settings. It's a joy to edit these ones where the actual image is good off the bat, and the detail is, you know, in the histogram's good, and have a look at that histogram now. It's perfect. You got everything's within the realm. Shooting at this time of day is crucial because you just get those beautiful flat, soft, dynamic ranges. Do we want to maybe crop there, or try and maybe crop there? This little bit out the side is just a bit distracting. I'm thinking, do we come to there and maybe just drop that down a bit? Still getting a bit of sky, maybe somewhere around about there. I'm just watching this bit here, and I'm just watching where we're cutting off down here. I don't want to cut off too much. But then just having that less distraction over there, I think works better. So really, that's yeah. Again, that's all I'd really do with that. That looks pretty cool. Like I said, with this beautiful thing, moon reflection there. Got some beautiful colour. All the clouds seem to be sort of all pointing down towards this middle bit down horizon, which is cool. There's some interesting stuff going on over here with the foggy water, which is lovely. And then you got all this stuff in the foreground. So there's lots going on here. It's one of those photos where you can sort of look into it and go, oh wow, there's something over there. That's pretty cool. That's nice down there. So yeah, that's a nice one. Just keep an eye on those pixels, hot pixels. There's another one in there. And there's another few over here. So there's quite a few hot pixels on that sensor there, Karen. So if you get a chance, maybe do a bit more research on that as to what's going on. But that's how I would edit that lovely shot from the edge of the world. All right, next one we're going to do is the last one of Karen's. Again, shot on the Canon. We're shooting ISO 100, f16, 24mm at 125th of a second. This is, again, this must have been down at the Pyman Heads, I believe, after we went on the boat trip. So it's about 11 o'clock in the morning. So the first thing it screams to me is there's people in the background here, which, that's me. There you go. There's people in the background. So I'm thinking what's sort of working for here, which is probably what caught your eye, Karen, is this section all in here. So let's crop accordingly. Let's get right in there and work on this beautiful sand pattern we have here. And let's see if we can try and find a crop that sort of works to incorporate them all in there. So maybe we're doing, maybe we're doing a bit more of a cross section. I like all these sections in here. Let's just bring it back a little bit there. Let's see how that looks. So yeah, I reckon maybe we might even go in a bit tighter. We've got a full frame here. We can really play around with it. This little stick going through here is a bit annoying for me. I'd like to not have that. So, it could be something as simple as sort of... Oops, that's not right. I didn't crop that much. Yes, I did. Maybe we're going to go a bit more. Something like that, maybe. I just like these patterns here. I'm just trying to find a way to crop in where we're sort of taking them all in without bringing too much other stuff in. It's a bit tricky, this one. We'll work on something like that, I think. Yeah, that can still work. This is annoying me, but this section and all this stuff here is really cool. But the first thing to me, like we're almost middle of the day, the first thing I'm thinking is black and white. So I think we might do this one as a black and white. So when you're in black and white, you can obviously just click up the top there and change into black and white or color, like so. The color temperature still works in black and white, but what you're doing is you're playing more around with the tones and not the color. So I'm going to sort of bump that up a bit more from where it was shot. You can see automatically we're getting these beautiful little circles there on the sand. Contrast, again, having sand and black and white, you probably bump this right up a fair bit. Automatically you can see straight away we're creating something really quite abstract and interesting with all these sand patterns here. Again, that's going to do my head in, but there's not much we can do about that. Again, highlights, we can take a few of the highlights down a little bit, but not much. Shadows, you know, do we want that detail on the log shadow there? We can probably bring a bit of it out. So we'll probably go like plus 45 just to bring a bit of this information out here. Texture, again, this is where you can go either way, but you know, this might be one where we actually do a bit more texture adjustment, minus 20, just to give it that really nice sort of soft feel. Clarity, again, I'm just playing with these, like it's, you know, the shadow detail in here is getting quite interesting when we bump it up a bit. And then dehaze, you know, whether or not you go much dehaze or not. But to me, it's all about these patterns in the sand. Again, we can always go back to this crop and see if, you know, doing something bigger is going to work. You know, maybe something like that might work. We're bringing more of these sand patterns in. So that'd be personal preference, how you look at sort of cropping that. So playing around with the highlights and a little bit of shadow detail there. There's beautiful light here, and all this sort of information there is really lovely. There's a lot going on in this shot. Again, there's lots of orange and stuff, so you can play around with them and get them right. So probably around about sort of plus 20. Be lots of yellow out there as well. So do both of those plus 20. Probably no green in there. Might be a bit of blue, no. So it's really just orange and yellow. Crack up the sharpness. And yeah, maybe go play around again with the color temperature as to how you want it. Sometimes sand shots, because they're what they call a high key shot, you might make them a bit brighter. But if you look at what the color temperature is in black and white versus color, it's a big difference as to what the color temperature is versus what it does in black and white. But yeah, that's pretty interesting. You know, you might even go, the crop's what's really confusing me here at the moment, which you can probably tell. Maybe we do a square crop. Maybe we just do a pure, maybe something a bit more Instagrammy sort of color crop there, where we crop a bit more. Try and get these logs all in there. You know, maybe it's something like that might work, where you've got a bit more depth with these logs all there. This little section up here's got a little bit of ripple in it. You know, there's some really nice patterns there. So yeah, that's cool. That sort of location's got a lot of potential. If you were able to spend a day down there, you'd be able to come up with some crazy shots with all the sand patterns and things like that. I'll probably maybe just vignette it a bit more. Maybe just put a bit more vignetting, darken those edges a bit more. Have a look at this contrast again. Black and white, you tend to go back and forth a bit with black and white. You know, do we bring that exposure down a bit more? Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah, but that'd be pretty much how I'd do that one. Like I said, there's lots of detail in here. Ideally, like this sort of section just in here, again, cropping, you know, whether or not it's just this section. You know, because you've got a full frame camera, like maybe you even just go that. You know, that becomes a really, really interesting abstract kind of shot. You know, depends on how you go. There's a million ways to skin a cat, they say. So I still think probably that square crop is how I feel most comfortable about this shot in general. So yeah, something like that would be how I do it. All right, next one to go here is Simone's shots. So we'll do a couple of hers. So this is shot on ISO 100 f16. It's a Canon as well. 10th of the second at 25mm. So this is down at the Stanley sunrise we did with these really cool rocks and stuff like that. So a couple of first things, there's a UFO in the sky there. I don't know what that is, a bit of smudge, or not too sure what that is, a smudge of some sort. And the horizon's a little bit downhill, so we can easily fix them up. So first things first, we'll go into, just zoom into there a bit more. We'll use the healing tool. Again, you can make it pretty big and it'll just pick up a spot from somewhere else. It's pretty cool how that works, the healing tool. Everything else is pretty good. We'll straighten up that horizon, so we'll just get that nice and straight there. Yep, so that's looking a bit better there. So straight away you can sort of see that we've got rid of that dot and we've straightened the horizon up. Histogram looks pretty good. No real shadow issues. The highlights are pretty good as well. We can definitely get them under control. So really this shot, there's a couple of things about this shot that are really cool. This sort of leading line of black rocks is really nice. And then obviously out here you've got these beautiful sun rays popping through there. So we'll try and make it a pretty interesting kind of edit here. A few things on the side here. You've got this little fence up there, little concrete barrier thing. I think that might also be Peter. Peter's sort of hiding away in the rocks there, which is okay. And just these two rocks on the side are a little bit distracting. So what I might do is I might just crop a little bit more out of that. Somewhere around about maybe probably there. I don't want to lose too many of these rocks or the sky. It just helps get rid of those details. But then all of a sudden these big rocks here become a bit more of a feature piece of this. So we'll bring the exposure up. Again, these rocks are pretty cool. As you can see, they're like a nice little leading line there. I'm not going to worry about editing Peter out. We'll leave him in there. So we'll bring up the contrast a bit there. Color temperature, you know, we probably don't want to go too warm. It's a bit of a cooler morning. Again, don't stress about the sky because we know that we can get that sky back. There is also a ship on the horizon there that you could potentially get rid of as well if you wanted to. See how good a job that does. Oh, that's a bit wobbly. So sometimes you can actually grab the other circle and move that around a bit, so that looks a bit better from a distance there. All right, so highlights. You know, we want to really get that sky back as well. We'll do a bit of a mucking around with that as we go along. We'll bring the shadows up for this foreground a bit here, which is pretty cool. And what I might do as well, we might warm up this whole foreground a bit, bump up the exposure a bit, and we might even just bump up the contrast a bit there. And then what we'll do is we'll bring this sky down and we'll cool that sky down a bit more. But this is looking a bit more entertaining in here now compared to what it was. You've got some really good contrast of black, and the brown rocks there works really well. Again, what we do here, we probably take the texture down a little bit. We'll probably keep this normal. We don't need to go too soft or too harsh there. We might just take the dehaze up a little bit more, just to get a bit more clarity in there as well. The highlights, again, I'm just purely looking at this foreground at the moment because we're going to come back and play around with that sky later on. So I'm just looking at all the highlights in that foreground. Again, the shadows, those rocks look pretty cool. Before and after, again, there's just so much detail in there. It's really cool. Orange, there's obviously a lot of orange there. We can play around with the brightness of the orange. Probably a bit of yellow mixed in there as well. And then we'll play around with the blue a bit in those clouds. And there's probably a bit of blue in those rocks as well. It's probably reflecting a bit of the skylight. And then we'll put the sharpening up to normal. And then what we'll do, we'll go back up and we'll see if we can either see how we go with the select sky tool. So that'll select hopefully all the sky there. And we'll see how we go if we just bring, we can bring the highlights down pretty easily. Whether or not you bring the exposure down just a tad. You can put the contrast up to help with those clouds. And this is where you might even go back to your crop tool and say, right, okay, are we really starting to miss out on a lot of this sky? Like, can we add a bit more of this sky back in? We wanted to sort of get rid of a few of those details that were a bit annoying on the side there, but maybe we put them back in to see if we can get more of that sky. And I think what we've also done is just introduce some pretty cool rocks in that foreground as well. These extra bits here. So now what we've done is we've actually added a bit more of the sky in, which I think works a bit better. So what you can do is you can go back to that tool, click on that little section, and we'll go back to playing around with that. So we can actually now start to really make that sky quite dramatic. And this is where I was thinking we could maybe even cool it down a bit, or whether or not you went warmer. I think that looks a bit too much. That looks probably a bit colder. So probably maybe we'll make it just a bit warmer than what it is. That way it works pretty well. And then texture, whether or not you make it, I think maybe dropping the texture down, making it a bit more dreamy in that sky. Again, clarity, you've got to be careful. You can sort of do a bit of clarity to help with that definition of the clouds there. And then dehaze, we'll leave dehaze alone. So that's what we've done on the sky only. So then obviously you press done down the bottom and then you're back to the whole thing. But that's looking pretty cool considering what we have. And even now that we've sort of gone back out, we've actually introduced this green over here. You know, you could get tricky with this concrete bin here. You could actually, what you could do is, if you go to the healing tool, you can say, right, well, I want to actually replace this ugly thing. And then what you can do, you can actually go and place it, you know, over the shrubs, or, you know, you can sometimes add, this might not work very well this time, but you can sometimes go and add, that's not going to work, it's going to look epoxy. The other thing you can do with this as well, if you hold down, you can actually paint. So you can actually hold down and paint over things, and you'll see there that it's going to allow us, it's probably going to work a bit better. What we might do is paint a bigger section and see if it picks up more of the rocks, or whether or not we want to go pick up, you know, maybe some more of that. It's just looking a bit iffy for some reason. It doesn't look like it's picking up a lot. Yeah, it's a bit tricky, that one. It would be nice just to get rid of that little ugly bit if we can. But for some reason, it's making it, sort of picking it up almost see-through, which is not what we want. We maybe want a bit more down here, a bit more of this darker section. Anyway, that's something you can work on with a bit more time. But apart from that, yeah, it's looking pretty good. But yeah, looking forward past what we've done, you know, we've got some beautiful detail and texture in here. We've got a beautiful sky complementing it. We've added in this little bit of green. The only issue I have with that green now is that it attracts me back to this sort of concrete bit. We'll try one more thing. We'll try and clone. Instead of healing, we can do what's called a cloning. And that might actually, that's better. But we've got to try and get a section of it that works a bit differently. Yeah, we'll leave it alone, otherwise we'll be there for hours doing it. But yeah, that's pretty cool. Whether or not we drop the contrast down a little bit on the whole thing, maybe we've gone a bit too far. The vignetting as well, we haven't done that, so we'll just add a bit of a vignetting around the outside. And that's how I do that. That's a pretty cool shot. I love the rocks and the sunrise. Yeah, pretty interesting shot. Excellent, well done. Right, yeah, the next one of Simone's, this one really caught my eye. It's pretty cool, the movement in the rocks, and I think this is also down at Arthur River, at the edge of the world. So again, we're talking about half a second, f5, ISO 100, about 40 mil. So this is, yeah, it's a bit more of an abstract kind of shot, which is pretty cool. Again, similar to Karen's shot earlier, where we had those sort of pastel colours, this is going to be fairly similar. So we're going to sort of try and keep that same feel to it without sort of going too much of the contrast and ruining it that way. So these ones can be pretty straightforward, I reckon, when you're editing, because they are just sort of a straightforward type of shot. I've got a bit of an idea I might try with this one as well. First thing I'm noticing as well is just a bit of darkening on the corners. That might either be some sand or might be just a bit of vignetting from the lens. We might just crop that out a sec just so it doesn't annoy me. So there we go, we've got some nice sort of fresher edges there. Whether or not we're talking about the sky there, I don't know if the sky is going to actually give anything to that. It's just a nice sort of compliment in the background there. But to me, it's all about this movement in the rocks. It's really, look at these beautiful little details in here. It's incredible. It's really nice. So, you know, we've got this sort of beautiful complementary foreground as well. Again, this is one where we're probably going to, you know, maybe make it a bit more dreamier with the texture. The shadow detail, we might just bump up the shadow detail a bit, just to sort of even out this sort of gradient of exposure through here. If we go too much, you can see it gets a bit darker around the edge there in the bottom. We want to try and just keep that fairly even, just to keep the whole feel of the shot going. Got some beautiful reflections in here. This is lovely through here as well. I'll just move that down to 100 there. So the clarity as well, you know, this is one where you can actually maybe drop the clarity. Instead of usually adding clarity, we might drop it down a bit. And the dehaze, we might even drop down. So we're just really creating a real sort of dreamy sort of feel to this shot. as opposed to, yeah, each their own. Maybe it is a bit too much with the texture being a bit soft. That looks a bit better there. That's better. Again, saturation, you know, whether or not you bump it up a bit, you might be able to add a bit of saturation, add a bit of vibrance to it as well. The highlights, you know, again, not really worrying about the sky. I'm not going to even bother touching the sky on this one. It's all about what's going on in the foreground. We just want to make sure this section here doesn't go too big with the highlights, so we want to just keep that under control. We don't want to lose too much detail in there. And then the shadows, again, just be careful of this bit here. But we've got some nice sort of rippling happening now. It's getting a bit nicer. The colour, you know, we can maybe drop the orange down a little bit just to help that sky a bit, and the yellow. There's probably a bit of blue in that water there. You can see the water's a bit blue. We can make that a bit brighter. Probably a bit of purple in there as well. I was thinking with this shot is actually how we've touched the colour temperature, maybe also touching the tint and just making it a bit more magenta. So just giving it a bit more of a magenta feel to it. Sort of has a nice sort of colour palette to it. Yep, something like that works. And again, we put the sharpness up to whatever it has to be, 85. And then whether or not, we probably won't vignette this because we were worried about this sort of corner section there. So we won't worry about that. The other question is, you know, is there too much sky up there? Are we actually putting too much sky in there? Do we maybe just crop a little bit further down to get a little bit more of that sky, so we focus more on these rocks? But that's pretty cool. Like, again, it's not much you'd have to do with this one. Pretty much almost out of camera is what you want. The histogram looks good. You got some beautiful movement. Got some really, really nice colors. All this water movement in here. This would print really nicely. You get all these little intricate details of all the water splashing around and stuff like that. So it's pretty cool. We might just make sure that these shadows in there aren't losing it, and we might just make it a tad brighter. Yeah, so that's really cool. You know, you could say, right, well, you know, just next time do a shot purely of this section only. But I like the reflections here. I like how we've got all this movement in the rocks there, and this is all beautiful through here, nice patterns and reflections. So yeah, that one's a pretty easy one, but it's a really, really effective shot. So looking for that water movement. It's only half a second as well, so keep that in mind if if there's a beach and there's water washing over rocks and things like that. You know, sometimes you don't need 10, 15, 20 seconds. Sometimes it's only half a second or a second to get this really cool effect that's going on. So play around with your shutter speeds and get a feel for what's working with the movement of the water as well. But that's a good one. Well done. All right, last one of Simone's here. Another sort of half-second shot, f16 ISO 100, f24. Focal length of 24mm. Again, I like what you're doing here, Simone. You're sort of exposing for the parts that are interesting. You know, we look at a histogram here. You know, people would look at this on the back of their screen and say, "Oh, that's just too dark. I can't get any information out of that." But there is information there. We can see that there's no lost details there. So what we can do is automatically you can open that up and see that all that information's there. But we've also got this amazing sky with the moon happening as well. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open it up here, and we're going to start exposing and playing around for this foreground and just get this foreground to look interesting. You'll excuse my dog barking in the background. I don't know what she's carrying on about. So automatically, we're just with a few adjustments here. You know, we're automatically seeing some interesting detail in what's going on here. Got a nice little bit of light over here coming through. Got some nice details. The crop is pretty good, just making sure it's straight. You know, whether or not we bring it up a bit more, you know, we've played around with the color temperature a bit. Again, this is one where we might just keep the parameters of the presence of texture, clarity, and dehaze where they normally are. That's pretty good. The sky is really going to complement what's going on here. Just looking around the outside of the frame, as I always do, there's this little rock down here. This sort of one down here could become a bit of a distraction to me. Do we maybe just bring it up just to clip that there, and also just getting that little gap there? Just takes away from that distraction down there. You've got some nice water movement through here. You've got some nice reflections through there. It's an amazing spot, Sarah Ann Rocks. So we'll just play around with the highlights there as well. Won't play with the shadows too much. So this is where I'll probably go back, and again we can try and do the select sky. Again, it's a pretty defined sky. You know, you've got really nice sharp edges to sort of separate that sky from the foreground. So usually in scenes like that, you can select the sky quite well. But this is where we can sort of bring that sky right down. And then we sort of up the contrast a bit. Drop the, we're probably going, there's a big dust spot there. Have you seen that? Right in the middle there's a big dust spot. What we might do, we'll just get out of there for a second. You can see there's a giant dust spot. That's a big one. So we want to just click on that, get rid of that for you. I think that's the only one I can see. Yep. So again, we'll go back to the sky. We'll just select on it and go back to where we were. Whether or not, you know, we've got to be careful. Just up here along that bottom bit, it looks like it's just looking a bit funny there. So we'll just be careful with that. And again, like we did on the last shot of yours, we can sort of add a bit of a feel to that color of the sky there once we finish doing a few things here. So just playing around with the dehaze and the texture and things like that. But this is where, again, you can sort of say, right, let's just play around with that sky. It's got some really nice color. We can actually, you know, let's make it a bit more magenta-y, sort of summery feel. Something like that. We've got this glow over here. I don't mind because you can actually see the glow coming through there, so that's fine. And then whether or not you bring it down and maybe just bring the shadows up a bit, just bring the overall exposure down a bit. Just getting it to a point where we're getting a nice balance where you can sort of see the detail, but not taking away from the sky either. So again, looking from start to finish. People would say, well, there's no way you can edit that way. You know, all the shadow detail is lost. Well, it's not. The shadow detail is there. As long as you're exposing correctly, the shadow detail is always there. I reckon we might just bring up that. Sometimes it's good to edit next to the one before and after. That way you get a bit of an idea of how much you get done. I'm just conscious of losing too much exposure in those forward bits, which might mean just up in the shadows a bit. It's just a bit of a balancing act here at the moment, just trying to get it all balanced so it looks natural in regards to the sky. I'm still a bit conscious about this bit here, so I might go back to the sky itself and just up the exposure a little bit of the sky overall. Moving down, again, we haven't played with any color temperatures or anything like that. We're just, or any color channels just yet. We're just going to play around with some oranges. And again, you can see straight away, if you go too far, you start creating banding. So you've got to be really careful. It's all about little bits and pieces that you play around with. You don't want to go too far. There'll be a bit of blue in the sky. There's definitely a bit of magenta because we've added it in there. The sharpness we go to +85. And then, you know, a bit of vignetting on the side. But this bit over here is lovely with this beautiful golden light. Got the moon up there. There's another little dust spot next to the moon. So we'll just get rid of that one. What we might do is we might do a full bit of a look at this one. We'll turn the visualize spots on and see if we can see any. There might be another little one over there somewhere, I think. But that's it. It's pretty good. But have a look on your center. There was a big one in the middle there. But again, that's a beautiful shot of Sarah Ann Rocks. Real moody, beautiful evening, great little moon, great detail. Again, yeah, just don't be sucked in by that histogram, by that screen saying that, hey, there's no detail in there, because it's there. As long as your histogram, not touching anything, we're not losing any detail, not losing any highlights or shadow detail. Perfect. Again, great shot, Simone. Good set of images you got there. Well done. Alright, next one we're going to do is one of the first ones of Lisa's. So I do remember this shot. This is on the, what was that, the southern side of the nut at Stanley. We had this beautiful colour and the clouds there. And had this little inlet of water. I think we had some big pelicans floating around as well. So again, histogram looks good, nice and even, no blowouts or anything. This is also shot on a Canon, or is it Nikon, I'm not too sure. Half a second, f11, ISO 80, which is nice and low, which is good. Shooting at about 24, 25 mil. First things first, it's a little bit downhill, crooked. So we can just straighten that up. Try and get in the habit of, this goes for everyone, try and get in the habit of trying to get your horizon straight in camera as well. Just one less thing you need to worry about when you come back to edit. Again, really sort of nice pastel-y colour. I like this sort of shape here in the foreground, and I like how it's sort of repeated on this side as well. So that's pretty cool. So we don't want to lose that detail there. So let's have a look. So we'll go up the contrast a little bit. We don't want to go too far with contrast. We want to keep this sort of pastel-y sort of feel about it. Probably can make it maybe a little bit warmer. And let's see if we can bring a little bit of these highlights down in the sky. Not much shadow detail in there. It's just really the sandbars that have got a bit of shadow and a little bit in the water. We might just drop them down a little bit. Just going to keep playing around. Again, we can play around with the color temperature and see what we want to do. I think somewhere around about there is good. Again, this is one where the texture, you can maybe bring it down quite soft to sort of get that nice sort of silky smooth sort of feel about it. Again, you could probably drop the clarity down. We might just up the dehaze a little bit just to help sort of get a bit of definition on these clouds and things like that as well. We're looking at the crop of it. We don't want to crop too much because we're going to lose these beautiful shapes here. But do we have too much sky on top? I don't know. We can maybe sort of try and bring it down a bit. We can maybe still keep that shape there. Like what we're losing on the outside there is nothing but dead sky and a little bit of that water over there, which isn't too bad. But just maybe a bit more evened out. Now we've got nice horizon on the top third. We've got some interesting details in that bottom third. Saturation again, whether or not you go up or down, you might add a little bit of vibrance and saturation. Highlights and shadows. Again, just watching the reflection in here. If we go too far, it becomes really, you start to lose whatever that kind of color in there is. And shadow, again, it's just those sandbars. We'll probably bring them down a little bit. And then, not much difference from start to finish, but what we're doing now is getting a bit more color, a bit more, interesting highlights and interesting shadows going on as well. We'll play around with these. And again, look at that. If you go too far, you just start really mucking it up. So you just got to be really, really, I guess, really easy on your adjustments. You don't want to go too far. And that's one mistake people do make, is they go a little too far with edits and stuff like that. So sharpness again at 85. The vignetting, we'll probably put a little bit of vignetting on here. Whether or not you go back up to the sky, whether or not we try and get a bit more of a gradient showing up in that sky. So I'm going to use the linear gradient and actually drag that down. So it's going to have, a bit more of a softer effect on that sky. And whether or not we sort of bring that down a bit, bring the highlights down a bit more. We can definitely make it a bit more dreamier with some texture adjustments. But we can try and make that cloud and that gradient stand out a little bit more. And again, like I said, you can always just drag and have a look and see. So now we've got a bit more of a gradient, sort of that sort of pink to blue really happening down there as well. So that sky now is a bit more interesting. Overall, I think we need to probably just bump the exposure up a tad. Yeah, something like that, just out of curiosity. Yeah, maybe not work that way. Maybe color I think's best. But I might take the saturation I put in there out of it, just to keep that same sort of pastel look. There is some beautiful little birds out there as well. But yeah, very simple shot, but it's more about how the shapes all work with this one. You got these beautiful S-bends all happening through it. And then, we've just got this interesting mountain range, the Rocky Cape National Park, and just this cloud formation with a nice gradient happening. It doesn't appear to be any dust spots or anything like that in here as well, which is handy. Yeah, the only thing that might enhance this is if we had a bit more color in the sky reflected in here. But if you did that, you might have to go a bit lower, a bit higher on your tripod, and you might lose these shapes. So to me, it's more about these shapes that are happening and the S-bends and everything else is just complementing it. So yeah, good start, Lisa. That was good. I remember that shot. It was interesting to see you do that. So well done. Right, yeah. Second one of Lisa's is in the forest. This looks like it might be the Tawata Arch part of the forest, perhaps. I like what you've done here. I like the log here, and we've got this sort of fern as a feature point. There's a bit of movement in that fern. It was pretty breezy in there from memory. Just keep an eye on that polarize as well. I think we said that with maybe Sam's image as well. Just keeping an eye on that polarizing of the ferns there. But again, histogram looks good. We don't have any major dramas in regards to that. We could actually look at cropping. It's quite a sort of wide sort of shot. So maybe what we can do is actually do it as like a cross-section profile of the forest. So let's play around with that. So I've just cropped it a bit. I'll change the color temperature a little bit. There's some amazing detail in these forests. We'll up the contrast a little bit, up to about plus 25. You know, you can actually, we can automatically just sort of make it a bit moodier. There's light on that log, that's nice, and everything else sort of complements the light over here. Again, just, straight off the bat, we've done minimal adjustments and automatically it's looking 1,000 times better. Highlights, again, you probably don't need to touch that, or if we do, we might just bring them down a bit that way. Shadow, this is where shadows work for you. If we bring it out and bring all the shadows out, all this beautiful detail under here, the shadow creates mood. If you do that, all that detail comes out. Sometimes you don't want as much detail as what you've got there. Again, we'll probably keep the texture and the clarity and the dehaze the same. It's looking pretty good. Saturation, I think we've got enough saturation in there. We'll probably play around a bit further down here with the color channels themselves. And we'll play around a bit with the shadows. And again, it's all about, to me, this fern's great, but it's all about these lights, this light along, the top of this log here. It's really interesting how we've got a bit of a skylight all happening in this section here, catching the green on these ferns, but lighting up all this amazing detail on the log. So it's just a real classic sort of forest scene. It's making me want to go back up to the Tarkine, to be honest. Again, all the orange in the forest floors is incredible. There's so much yellow and orange and greens. And again, this is where we can play around with a bit more of the greens of the ferns up here. You can see them changing quite a lot. Probably a bit of blue, tiny bit of blue that's reflecting from the sky in there. But the rest is pretty good. 85. So this must have built-in. This might be. Yeah, I'm trying to think what camera this is now. I can't remember what you had. Is it a Fuji, DSC, or is it a Nikon? I'm not too sure. You'll have to tell me. And again, put a bit of vignetting on there, and yeah, like forest scenes. I find forest scenes quite easy to edit. A lot of people do struggle with getting the composition in the forest to start with, but to me, it's all about these shadows and moods and these little skylights that pop in on these beautiful parts of the forest. So you can automatically see, like straight away, that looks a lot better. The detail on that log, which we'll go in closer, looks even better. You've got this beautiful, interesting detail. You got the moss and the colour and the real sort of, typical Aussie sort of colours in the forest there, which is great. So low saturation, they're mixed in with these higher saturated ferns. There's not much you'd really change with this. Like I said, forest scenes can be a bit messy. Trying to find those little skylights or trying to find interesting trees and, bits of log that come out. That's the real challenge in forest, to get that right. So, but yeah, that's a good job. It's a really straightforward forest shot, but it works, and it's again, it's exposed well. It's edited fairly easy. That's only taken a few minutes to get it to look like that from that. So when you've got your exposure right, the polarizing filter probably would have helped a little bit more with some of the vibrance of colors through here, but it's still come up okay. So good job. All right, so we're going to do the last one of Lisa's 3, and this one caught my eye a bit. Really quite dramatic. Got these really cool rocks, and it's like something out of Game of Thrones or something like that. This movement in the reeds and the grass looks quite interesting. We've got a big wave crashing over there. We've got someone standing over there. I don't know who that is. Let's see if we can picture who that is. Hard to tell from this angle, but probably someone in our group. So yeah, there's a lot going on in this shot. The one thing I would like to have seen, and maybe it's not possible based on the camera you're using, I would have liked to have seen just a bit more room above the thing here, and maybe a bit more room above this rock here, because you really haven't got much sky, and now you've got a bit of a gap up here, which is a little bit distracting. So if anything, I'd be more inclined to just try and shut that gap down a bit, and then maybe just come in a bit. I just want to try and work that out if we can, just so there's a solid sort of corner there as well. Again, the horizon looks pretty straight, which is good. Yeah, cool rocks. I think I know where this is. I think I've been here before as well. Actually, that might be me up there, I think. That is me. I remember where you were now, Lisa. I came up and I was watching you up there. Cool. All right. So let's see what we can do here. I think this will be a pretty cool one. Again, we can play around with the color temperature. Again, as soon as you put some contrast in, away you go. Again, this location is just incredible for photographs. It's pretty cool. So yeah, there's some beautiful color in the water there. The oranges on the rocks is all working as well. Shadow detail. We're taking a bit of the highlights down, playing around with the shadows. Texture, I'll make it normal -10. We'll put a bit of clarity and a bit of dehaze in there. Saturation, again, I find Saran rocks is a fairly muted place for color. You've got very rustic colors, so saturation and rustic colors don't always go together that greatly. So playing around with the highlights, just keeping an eye on this wave here. We don't want to go too far and make it look a bit silly. So we'll definitely bump it up, but keeping an eye on it. Shadow detail as well. We'll just go down a bit with shadow detail. And again, just a couple of different edits. Look at the different colors there, and everything from the browns, the aqua sort of color, the greens, the orange, the yellows. You've got everything going on in here, which is even a bit of green down there as well. So that's what I look for when I'm playing around with the color channels. I'm like, okay, well, there's lots of orange in there. How do we make them sort of stand out a bit more? There's a bit of yellow in there as well. Okay, there's a bit of green there. Can we bump that green up to make it look a bit interesting? The blue and the sky and the water. You can play around with that. So when I see the colors, I'm like, okay, there's different colors in here that we can play with, and you can really sort of dictate, how they sort of stand out a bit more once you identify the colors as well. So it's really cool. I've just noticed all that detail in there as well, which is great. The sharpening to 85 as always, and then the vignetting. Now you'll notice I haven't even bothered touching the sky, because the sky is not really a dominant part of this shot. I haven't bothered about it. Whether or not you got rid of me out of there as well, whether or not you want that person there or not, it might be fairly easy to get rid of me. If we do something like that, you can sort of see it's fairly easy to get rid of someone. So it's a bit of a scrappy job to it, but we won't probably do that. But yeah, it is pretty easy to get rid of someone, if we wanted to do that. And sometimes you can just put, you can put another rock in there. But yeah, we'll leave it as it is. Yeah, but that's, again, really cool shot. Like I said, I would have liked to maybe seen a bit more sky and maybe a bit more of that, but obviously you've made this your centerpiece. That fan of movement works really well. Even the little rocks in here are pretty cool. You've got these real sharp, jaggedy rocks there. You've got some beautiful movement. So you've almost got really soft sort of feel versus real drama and violence, which works really well together. You could call it some sort of juxtaposition, which everyone loves to throw that word out, between the real sort of soft flow of the water versus the real crazy rocks of Saran rocks. But yeah, that's a cool one, a good location. Another thing maybe as well, this sharp thing here, just to get a bit of separation to that background. So maybe moving your tripod across to the right a bit more and having this section more in the water like this one, so you can actually see it sort of almost marries into that background. So that is a really tight spot to shoot from, so it's probably not doable anyway, but just a bit of food for thought. But yeah, good shot, I love it. Saran rocks, really cool spot. All right, so let's get stuck into Michelle's images. So there's 3 of Michelle's images, sorry. This one is from the first sunrise we did at Stanley, I think, from memory. So again, looking at the histogram, looks pretty good. ISO is under 100, f14, 21mm and the 30th of a second, which is fine. First thing I've noticed is a little bit downhill just with the horizon, so we'll just get that all corrected there. Again, we've got a good histogram here, plenty of detail that we can use to get some information out of here. So again, we can make it look really bright and see what sort of information we've got in the shadows there. So again, this would be one where we probably play around with the sky separately to the foreground, but just having a look at the crop of it, looks fine. The horizon's pretty much on that third there. Got the nut, or the Stanley nut, on the right hand side, which is good. Got a bit of sunlight coming on the left, so it looks all like it's fairly balanced in regards to composition, which is good. So let's have a look. We'll take some of the highlights down out of the whole scene there. We'll bump up the contrast a bit as well. I'm looking at the rock there. There's a bit of detail in there, but we need to bring a bit of that out, like so. So that's good. And something along the lines like that. Color temperature, not too bad. Again, we'll probably do something on the sky. The sky's got some really cool clouds up here, which is interesting. There's a dust spot there that we can see, so we'll use the healing tool, and we'll just click on that, and it'll pick up and change that straight away, which is awesome. So that's pretty good. Yep, that's all looking fine there. Again, texture, I'll probably keep the texture the same on this one, -10, the clarity +10, and dehaze +10. But let's go and have a look at this sky, see if we can select the sky and see what happens here. So it's obviously picked up all of that. I think we're going to get some pretty moody sort of clouds there. There was a moment there, I remember, where it did get pretty moody with the sky and the clouds. So I'm just going to play around with them a bit. Again, this is where you can sort of make the sky look a bit bluer or a bit warmer. I think it looks a bit better if it's a bit stormier, to be honest. We'll leave that alone. Again, this is where you can either get a bit of texture or take a bit of the texture out. We might take a bit of the texture out on this one, which is good. And then clarity, we'll just bump the clarity up a little bit. And then the dehaze, we might take a bit of dehaze out. So again, just really bringing that sky into the fore there. Looks pretty cool. Again, there's not much going on in this foreground, so I think we did speak about this as well, Michelle, trying to get some interesting things in your foreground. So there's not much going on there that we can sort of show any sort of real interest in the foreground. It's just a few rocks and a bit of reflection. This bit over here is nice where it reflects the rock. But to me, it's probably more about that sky and trying to make that sky just stand out as much as I can without sort of taking away too much from that foreground as well. Yeah. Just playing around with some of these color channels. And just making sure we get some cool detail in that sky there. Yep, a bit of vignetting. Let's have a look. So before and after, you can see there that we've created something interesting. Like I said, it would have been nice to have maybe some more interesting subjects in the foreground, maybe even being set up near these rocks, having them more in your foreground. But the sky is cool. It certainly has potential to be a good shot. Just going to play around a little bit more, just to increase the exposure a bit. I might go back to that sky and just darken it up a bit. You could make it really quite dramatic and stormy if you wanted to, give a bit of mood to it. But yeah, that's about as much as I'd do with that one. Again, it's more about getting some foreground interest in these shots. But the sky is really cool. This looks really interesting there. Even if you shuffled your camera away from that sun and more at the rock, or vice versa. But it's a good start. Again, the exposure was spot on, which is great. And now it's just, once you get that exposure, it's just more about getting that composition of something a bit more interesting going on in that foreground. It's just to bring the viewer into the shot a bit more. All right, second one of Michelle's. I think this one's going to work a lot better than the first one. I think I can already see there's some really cool things going on in the sky there with some sort of sun rays popping up from below the horizon. This is shot at half of a second, a fifth of a second, f11, ISO 200, shot it pretty wide, so 12mm. So again, first things first, we're not losing, there's a bit of shadow detail lost in the foreground, but I reckon we'll be fine with that. The sky's been managed well, and we've got that crescent moon and a few things going on in there. Again, first thing I'm noticing, there's a bit of a dust spot as well, so we'll just get rid of that dust spot. And you'll find most dust spots just rock up in the same spots each time because they're on the same sensor. So yeah, more about this sky. You can see that there's some really cool sun rays popping up from around the bottom of that horizon. So we're going to try and use that as best we can. The sky is really quite impressive. We may have underexposed a little bit just to see how much detail we can get out of that. It's going to be quite a dark scene. Although we can bump it up a bit more, we can bump that sky back a bit, and again we can use the sky replacement filters and things like that to really get that under control. We'll just make sure it straightens up for horizon. I've got some beautiful sand in the foreground here. I know you sat here for a while, Michelle. I remember you sitting there for a while doing this shot, which is great. And like I said, we've got these amazing sort of sun rays coming out, which you don't see too often. So it was well captured to see that. But what we're finding is a little bit of noise in these shadows. So in shadows you get a little bit of noise, which is that grainy effect. So I reckon you might have been maybe a stop underexposed too much on this one, but it's not a big deal. And again, talking about the foreground interest, there's something like these sandbars here. They're quite interesting, a bit like Michelle's shot earlier with the sand in the foreground. Sorry, not Michelle, Karen's shot earlier. So sometimes you can incorporate that bit more interest in the foreground. The other thing you could do with this one is we could go to a different ratio, and we could try and maybe just crop out that foreground and use those rocks and the clouds and the sun rays, just to create something down the bottom. You could do something like that where you've got some more interesting patterns in the foreground. But for now, I think that's probably an option that you can do if you want, Michelle. But for now, I reckon we'll just keep it as is, as shot. And we'll work on it how we can. The moon was really cool on that time, it was great. Again, we can add a bit of that sort of dreamy feel to it. We'll add a bit of clarity and dehaze. That's looking pretty good. Again, you maybe add a little bit of saturation and vibrance. Let's see, we don't want to go too far on the highlights because we're going to try and make sure we manage those little sun rays coming out. We're going to try and highlight them if we can. So we'll just play around with these a bit and then we'll go back and do our sky adjustments. You can see the blue sky starts to bring it out. We can drop that down a bit, which is pretty cool. Drop that down a little bit, just making sure we can start to see them a bit better. We'll go to 85 sharpening. We might actually put a bit more of noise reduction in this one as well. So there's another slider here called the noise reduction slider. So we might put that in. It's just going to take a little bit of that graininess out of the foreground, which will help if you ever want to print them. We'll put them in there as well. Clicking the chromatic aberration and profile corrections. Cool. All right, we'll go back up to here and we'll select that sky. And then we'll see what we can bring out of that. So I'm really wanting to bring those sun rays a bit more prominent. If we can do that somehow, I think we're going to be able to. Again, you can maybe, I know we took the texture out of the whole image, but we're going to add a little bit of clarity and texture back into this sky. I think it's just going to help bring out those sun rays a little bit more. So we click OK, and then I think I found another dust spot over there too, so we'll get rid of that one. Oh, that's the same one. I didn't get it very well, so let's make it a bit of a bigger example. There we go. That's better. So straight away there, you can sort of see that we've got the sky under control. We can probably bump everything up a little bit, somewhere around about there. Yeah, I reckon maybe in this foreground, I reckon you've maybe got a stop too much underexposed. It's just started to lose a bit of that detail, and we can see that when we turn the indicator on at the start there. So, but we've still managed it. The sky is pretty incredible. You've exposed for the sky well. It's just that probably didn't expose great for that foreground, but we've been able to bring it back and rescue it pretty well. This would have been really nice in the foreground, maybe a bit more of those ripples. It was pretty dark at that stage, so perhaps you weren't able to even really see them anyway. It was too dark. But that's pretty cool. It's a cool shot. We might even just bring up those shadows a bit more, just to see what it looks like. So yeah, that's really cool. That's a really nice moment and some beautiful colour. So well done. Right, yeah, we'll go to the last one of Lisa's 3, and this is another one from Stanley, up the end with our friendly other photographer who didn't want us being there. That was quite funny. This one is gonna look good, I think. This has got some real potential. We'll show that, you know, we've got not much detail lost, which is great. We've got a really interesting sky. We've got a really interesting foreground topic, which is really good. Again, this is shot f16, ISO 100, 21mm, an eighth of a second, which is good. Straight off the bat, I think it looks straight. It's good. There's no reason to straighten up the horizon with that. Again, what I like to do is just open up everything, have a look, open up all the exposure. And just to let you know, these are the first times I'm looking at these images. I haven't sort of had a look at them. I'm just opening them up and developing them. I can't even say that word anymore. Developing them as I see them. So always good just to open up the exposure, see what information we've got in the shadows, which is pretty good. This little sign's a bit of a pain, whether or not we can try and crop that out maybe. I think we might be cropping, or maybe we might just crop in a little bit more just to make it look not as full on there. So again, you know, what have we got in the shadows? You know, we've got some really cool stuff in the sky. You know, this one will be good, I reckon. So we'll keep an eye on the sky. We'll put the contrast up to maybe 30. Bring the sky highlights and everything down of the whole shot there. We've got some beautiful warm light. It was a good morning, this one, even though it was a bit cold and a bit windy. It actually worked a lot better than I actually thought it was going to work. I actually thought we were going to have a bit of a wipeout that morning, but we didn't. So that's pretty good. We might bring a bit more of the shadows out. Yep, that's pretty cool. Again, we've got really good balance of exposure here, so you know, we might not even have to do anything for the sky. We might be able to just get away with this out of one single edit, which if that's the case, that's sort of almost the ultimate aim, to not have to do too much. So that's looking pretty good. Again, that beautiful light coming across. I haven't touched the white balance. Like we could even, you know, whether or not you, let's see, maybe warm it up just a little bit, just to give it a little bit of that extra warmth. Got some beautiful detail at the back here, which is great. You got some beautiful light across here. You got some beautiful light hitting the side here, which is great. It's a really nice composition. It's just that damn sign, which is not your fault. That's, you can blame the local councils for those ones, but sometimes they just get in the way a little bit. So just playing with them. There's no green in there. The blue in the back of the sky, we can play around with that a bit more. You know, we can do the sharpening, and we can do the vignetting. We'll turn all those lens profiles on, and we'll do a little bit of vignetting. And what I might just select the sky just to see what we can get out of it. So see if it picks it up nicely, but it's looking pretty good as it is. So, you know, whether or not we drop the sky exposure a little bit, you know, just bring it all down a tad, and then what that'll allow us to do, it'll allow us to be able to bump up the overall exposure a bit more. Again, we could also just play around with the texture a bit of the sky. We could, you know, you could actually bump it up or bump it down. I sort of like it being a bit bumped down. We'll play around with the clarity. Dehaze is one you've really got to be careful of. It can be a bit gnarly if you go too far with it. But again, just looking before and after, that's pretty cool. It's a little bit dark at the moment. That's because I did that. I just wanted to bring up that thing in the middle. Sorry, the ruins. We might go back to the sky. And again, you can go back to your masks at any stage and play around with them. What you got to do is just remember though that when you're in the mask, it'll come up with this different box here that we're working on. This extra grey box here. Make sure you click done. And yeah, look at that. That's pretty cool. I like it. I like it a lot. It's got some really good feel to it. We could probably, something else you can do, which I don't do very often, but there is something else you could do. I was going to say you could maybe paint in a bit of that information on the rock in the background there. For some reason my mouse isn't working. Why is that not working? There we go. You could paint in a little bit of contrast in the back there. So if you wanted to, similar to a mask, you could actually do a new mask. And then what you can do is you can actually brush in. So you can change the size of your brush, but we could potentially go around all this little rock here and do something like this. So we can paint all the rocks. So anything that's red is what's going to get affected when you play around with the mask. But you could go into there, and then what you could do is you could really just bump up your contrast on the rock a bit more only. And again, you can sort of just keep painting in around the side. Just be careful of edges because they sometimes get a bit of a halo around them. But I just felt like that rock needed a bit more contrast. So you can do that as a mask as well. So there's lots of things you can paint over the top. But you know what, that's a cool shot. I'd be really happy with that myself. Beautiful colour, beautiful sky. Just that sign's a bit of a pain. Like I said, whether or not you try to crop it out or not, if you did try and crop it out, I think it becomes a bit too squashed. So I'd be leaving it as it is. But hey, that looks great, Michelle. Starting from that to that, you've exposed really well for the sky. Got some really interesting foreground. You can see the difference that a foreground topic makes to a shot, having that interest in the front of the frame there makes a huge difference. But right time of day, beautiful light, really nice shot. So well done. That's a really nice one. All right, welcome back. Let's do the last three that we're going to do out of this whole session. These are three from Cheryl, which is shot on the Olympus camera. This was on the way to Corinna, on the way out of Waratah. We had that view back down the valley. So it was very golden light, very bright. So we can have a bit of a play with that. So this is shot at f16 ISO 200, 40mm, which is the equivalent of 80mm, 200th of a second. So again, first thing we look at, histogram, looking good. We've got detail in all the shadows and highlights, which is great. So that's awesome. A little bit of a band of cloud here and then some blue sky over there. So we'll have a look at that, whether or not we sort of crop it down a bit more just to get less of that space above. Probably the first thing I'd do. These ones are quite fun because you can really sort of overexpose things like so. Even though it's sort of counterproductive, even though we're sort of not even worried about the sky, you can sort of it's very bright and a very glary scene. You can actually make it look like that. So we've got these beautiful, all the colour touching the tops of all these trees, beautiful layers through there. What we can do is bump up the colour temperature a bit to make it look a bit warmer. Yes, we're going to start blowing out some of that sky. There's two ways you can do it. You can overexpose or underexpose it. I like to sort of overexpose these ones and sort of really get that real feel of warmth and colour coming through those valleys there. So shadow detail, you can bring the shadow detail up. Again, we can keep sort of adjusting as we go along. But what I'm looking for is all this beautifulness through there. It's just layer upon layer upon layer, which is great. Again, you can, either way you can go texture or no texture. I like to take a bit of the texture out of these ones, add a bit of clarity. Now, the one thing that people might think is, well, it's very hazy, let's dehaze it. Well, if you dehaze it though, you introduce a lot of noise. So I would still stick to maybe just a small amount of dehazing. These little things down here are annoying me. There's a couple of trees down there. So what we might do is just crop a little bit more in. I like this little hill over here, so we want to make sure that. And I always like to try and keep the intersections of valleys in frame as well. So that's pretty cool. Again, whether or not you do more contrast, we might do a bit more contrast there. And if you see the difference between before and after, really nice bright sort of scene. This one would probably work as black and white as well, but I think the colour and getting that colour temperature nice and warm just adds a bit more to it. Sort of shows that it is a a bright, warm day that we've got that beautiful light with. So again, playing with the highlights. The highlights in this one, I'm happy to sort of lose a lot of those highlights, because really you're shooting into the sun. You don't expect to get too much detail out of those clouds and stuff like that, so it wouldn't worry me. Again, just making sure, you know, we've got some beautiful colour going through here now, which is great. Alright, let's try the colour channels and let's see, we might be able to bring a little bit more of that valley detail by dropping some of this colour. Would have been lovely to have like a big lot of fog through here. Again, this is one of those places where sometimes you go to other spots, you drive past, you go, geez, that would look good then. Or, you know, if it's in your local area, put it on your list to go back to and visit at some stage, because, you know, if the conditions are right, you know, you might get yourself a really, really cool shot that, you know, that you don't normally see. So these ones I find pretty easy to edit. You know, whether or not we went darker and sort of did that with a bit more cloud, you could definitely go that way. That's my way of doing this way is purely personal choice. There's no right or wrong about it. I like to have it sort of more glary and bright and warm, as opposed to being a bit more like that. But again, that's just personal preference, what you think works better. You might think this looks nice. I'm not worried about the clouds all blowing out. There's still actually detail in them, so you can see with the highlight clippers on, we're not actually blowing out detail. It's still there. It's just, it is a very bright scene, but, you know, it gives you an idea that, you know, it's a really bright day, beautiful golden light. You know, got all these beautiful layers upon layer, and, you know, all the way down the end of that valley, which is great. So these ones I find pretty easy, but that's about what I would do with that. Again, contrast, you can sort of go a bit harder with contrast. You know, you can sort of see the more contrast we put in there, the more defined those valleys become. But you just want to be careful. You don't want it to be too grungy and dark. Yeah, it looks good. Yeah, another one you could do if you don't want the clouds there. Again, I do like the 16:9 crop, where you can actually sort of just get right in there and do something along those lines, where you sort of cut that sky out altogether, but you're really, really, really looking down into the valley. So again, that's an option for you as well. Again, yeah, there's never a right or wrong way. It's just depending on how you want to set your shot up and what you're looking for and what sort of effect you're getting and how you want it to look, really. So yeah, I like that one. It's I think I got a similar shot on mine, because I think I took a couple of happy snaps when we were there. You know, you do have the telephone lines there. One thing you could look at doing, if you want to be cheeky, is you could go and just put another bit of forest in there. If you want it to be real environmentalist, you know, you got a few more down there which are a bit harder to pick up, but that gap on the hill you can get rid of nice and easy as well. So it's just another option. But yeah, good start, Cheryl. That's a good one, and really nice layers and good colour there. All right, another one of Cheryl's. I do remember the shot. We sort of helped set each other up here for this one. So this is ISO 800, f8, 4 seconds at wide angle, 8mm or 16mm equivalent. So now, yeah, really nice foreground. It's nice and sharp. You got some interesting rocks there, and I think there was one that we did with a bit of a moon. The moon wasn't far out of this one, but we'll definitely give this one a go. It looks like, first things, it looks like it's straight, which is great. Let's have a look at what's in this foreground. Got some beautiful colour and stuff like that. So again, having these interesting foreground topics really does help sort of just make things look better in a shot, in my opinion. You've got to be careful here with the contrast. We don't want to sort of lose all that detail in all the old dried kelp and stuff. That's all dried out kelp, so we don't want to lose that too much. But let's just bring the highlights down a bit. We might be able to bring a bit of that shadow up. It's probably looking a little bit cold as well, so I'm just going to warm it up a little bit. Just bring the exposure down a little bit. So now I'm looking at the foreground. We've got amazing detail in here. We've got all this dried kelp. We've got all the colours of the rocks. We've got some golden colours. We haven't worried about the sky yet, because as you know, we sort of get to that later. Again, I'll be dropping the texture down. I'll be adding a little bit of clarity, a little bit of dehaze, and again, straight off the bat, just by a little bit of adjustments, you got all this amazing color and detail in the shadows, which is great. And we've got a really nice gradient coming through that sky, which is great. Again, whether or not you play around with the saturation and vibrance a little bit, watching the highlights, again, the sky, again, the shadows, we don't want to go too much with the shadows. We want to keep this, there's a lot of detail in there and really cool colors and stuff like that. So playing around with the individual color channels, I'm just looking at the rocks there, the yellow on the rocks, we can sort of make that a bit brighter and a bit stand out a bit more. There's a bit of blue in that sky we can bring down, there's probably a bit of purple, a bit of that. We'll play with the sky a bit. I don't know if we're going to have to do much to the sky, to be honest. If anything, we might just bring, yeah, not much. We don't want to do too much because we're going to start getting sort of banding. But we can just make it that little bit darker. We can probably maybe smooth the texture out a bit on it as well. But I don't think we really want to do too much. It was a pretty nice sort of sky there. Again, you could go with what I did before. We could make it a little bit more magenta if you want to make the sky a little bit more purple. Just have to be careful then. It looks like there's a little bit of banding happening there, so we might have to go back down to this purple and magenta, yeah, and just turn them off a bit. There was a bit of banding going on through there. There doesn't seem to be any dust spots on here, which is great. Nice and sharp. Maybe just bring that foreground shadow up a little bit, just to make sure we can see all that really cool kelp, which is great. So yeah, something like that. Pretty straightforward. Again, exposed well. We exposed for the sky we managed, and this is what I was saying as well about having this dynamic range. So if you're shooting at the right time of day, you really do get some great dynamic range options. So you don't have to be sort of trying to squeeze all these exposures out of a massively exposed highlights and shadows scene. You can actually get it all in one little shot. Little to do when you edit, all the information's there. So shooting at the right time of day is just so paramount. It saves you having to do so much more work when you get down into Lightroom or Photoshop. And the last thing we'll do on this one, we'll put a bit of vignetting around the side just to sort of tighten it up a bit. But yeah, that's cool. We don't need to worry about the lens profiles or chromatic aberration. It gets done in the camera with these ones. Really nice shot, I like it, and that's how I do that one. Good job. Alright, this will be the last one we do out of the whole series. So we've done about 18 different shots, so big editing getting done here. So this is another one from that same morning from Stanley, which is great. I think this is taken from the corner, which is a good place to take the shot from. Having a look at it, looks like it's nice and straight, which is great. We won't do it as 16. Oh no, you did actually shoot stuff in 16:9. There we go. So this is shot f16 ISO 200, equivalent of 16mm, and it's about a sixth of a second. I really like this sort of shape in front. It sort of walks around with the beach there. There is a bit of a pole there in the foreground, which isn't a huge issue, but whether or not we could just slightly crop it out of there, I don't think we're going to lose too much in regards to that sun. So maybe something along those lines, just to get it out of the foreground. We have a couple of little lens flares, which is pretty natural. You can get them anywhere. So we might just get rid of that there. Again, just using the clone tool or the heal tool. I think that might be one down there as well, just sort of in there. So they're easy to get rid of. Not a problem, they're done. Histogram looks good. We're not losing any details. We've got the same skies as what Michelle had in her shot, obviously at the same time. So we can really play around with that. So again, we're going to bump up the exposure a bit. Let's add a bit of contrast. Maybe a bit of warmth in the color temperature. We'll take a little bit of the highlights down overall. And I reckon you might have another little flare on the rock there. So we might just get rid of that one as well. Better. So shadow detail. We don't need to go bring too many shadows. Oh, it's a really beautiful light. That whole, even the light catching the waves there is really nice. So yeah, it's looking pretty good off the bat, which is again what we want. Editing really shouldn't be a chore. It should be just to quickly fine tune what we're doing, making sure we sort of recreate what we saw out in the field and putting it on our screen. So that's what we're doing here. We'll probably do something to that sky in a second as well. So I'm just going to play around with the oranges. Just looking at that orange in the foreground, we'll just brighten that up a bit. There'll be a bit of yellow out there as well. Definitely a bit of blue in the sky. And then we'll add a bit of sharpening as we always do. So what we'll do now, we'll just go and grab that sky. So go to our little masking tool and to select sky. And I reckon first things first, we need to maybe just warm the sky up a little bit, but then just bring it underexposed a bit. It's just looking a bit blue off the bat there. So I like to try and make them maybe look a little bit warmer. Add a bit of contrast just to get those clouds a bit more separated. We can sort of drop down the highlights of the sky a bit. And again, texture, you know, whether or not we go, I think a bit more of a dreamy look works for this one. Whether or not we add a bit of clarity or not. Maybe a tiny little bit. And dehaze, actually taking the dehaze out is actually helping with the overall color as well, which is a bit weird. So we might do that, and then what we can do is bring up that whole bit a bit in the foreground. Just get this really nice light there. We'll go back to our sky and we'll just drop that down a bit further. So now we've got a bit more of a balance. You've got some really nice light hitting the side of the nut there. There's another little lens flare out there as well. And this lens flare, that could be maybe just a bit of dirt on the lens as well. So, or maybe not dirt, what's the word I'm looking for? Maybe a bit of, yeah, maybe a bit of dirt on the lens. Actually, that's not getting rid of it as much as I thought it would. You got to be careful when it picks up a spot that's exactly the same as the first spot you're trying to go for, because it'll look odd. So we could probably get away with that. Yep. And again, yeah, there's some nice light around there. We might do what we did as well, where we grab the masking tool, create a new brush, and we go and actually paint across this thing. We might just give that a bit more contrast. It's just a bit washed out, or a bit not as sort of defined as I'd like it to be on that face. So we'll just do a little bit around there, probably a bit down there. So this is just holding a mouse button around and just painting, adding it in. We'll go down there as well. So then when you go back to your contrast, you can sort of see straight away. Pretty clever tools what they do these days. You can change the exposure, but mainly just the contrast is what I wanted to change. So now the nut really sort of stands out a bit, and you have a look at that. That's a pretty big difference between two little shots there compared to what we have. There's some beautiful light all around here, really nice light out there. Got some good sky. It's just a beautiful spot. I really like this glow down here, which is great. And I also like the glow that's catching all these little grassy bits along here. So yeah, pretty cool. You know, whether or not we chuck a bit of vignetting on there as well. Yeah, it's pretty good. Yeah, I reckon that's done. It looks pretty good. That's a pretty true representation of what we saw that morning. Again, this is why getting the exposure in the camera is really important. Using a tripod, you know, getting something interesting in your foreground, composing quite well in your shots as well. Just having said that, just looking at that, are we splitting this scene in half too much? Like, have we given it too much? Maybe we need to give a bit more foreground or a bit more sky, because at the moment we're almost cutting that in half. So I reckon maybe we try and push it down a bit further, get maybe more of that foreground in, and then that looks a bit better. I think you don't want to try and cut it in half. You want to try and have that horizon close to 1/3. You know, whether or not, if you went this way, you'll probably find it's a bit more balanced this way, but you lose that beautiful foreground color. So I'd be more inclined to go the other way, keep that little mound in front, and do it that way. So yeah, that's it, guys. Thank you once again for coming on the Tarkine workshop. I hope you had a great time. You've all got some wonderful images here. I'll put this into a proper recording. All of them will be in the same recording, so you can skip through and see who shots and what we did. I'll also send out the edits as well. I'll try and figure out how to send out the adjustment files for you guys, so you can download these files and it'll automatically install it into your Lightroom against the original file. So it's going to add all the edits that I've done, so you can see what I've done hands on. But thanks again. Hope this has been helpful. Hope to see you again on one of the workshops, and if not, take care of yourselves. Keep shooting, keep happy, and we shall talk to you soon. Thanks, guys.